I want to start a new series, and it's going to sound simple at first, but it's one of those ideas that gets more unsettling the longer you sit with it. The series is about how the state trains its citizens, not in the cartoonish way people imagine when they hear words like indoctrination, as if there's a villain behind a curtain pressing buttons, but in a much more mundane and much more powerful way. So the state teaches you what's normal through the structure of everyday life. It teaches you what to expect and what counts as reasonable, what kinds of problems are thinkable, what kinds of solutions are imaginable, and what kinds of resistance feel pointless before you ever try. And I want to be clear about something up front because this framing tends to make people nervous. When I say the state, I'm not talking about one person, one party, or even one ideology. In political anthropology, the state is understood as a set of institutions, practices, and routines that organize power and shape behavior. It's not just laws and leaders, it's schools, courts, policing, paperwork, infrastructure, borders, public health systems, tax structures, transportation, zoning, licensing, welfare programs, and all the everyday interfaces where your life encounters an institution that can say yes or no. So if you want to understand how power works, you don't start with speeches, right? You start with the ordinary. Most people think of politics as something that happens elsewhere during elections or scandals or parliamentary debates, and then they wonder why their daily lives still feel scripted in ways they didn't choose. And that's because the most effective political training doesn't arrive as persuasion, it arrives as environment, right? It's built into what you have to do to survive, what's easy, what's difficult, what's punished, what's rewarded, what's delayed, and what gets reframed as your personal responsibility, even when it clearly isn't. So when I say the state is a teacher, I mean something very specific. The state teaches through repetition, through friction, and through invisibility. Repetition turns behavior into habit. Friction shapes behavior by making some actions costly and others effortless. Invisibility is what turns all of this into common sense, which is the most effective hiding place power has ever found. Right? There's some theoretical frameworks that help put language to this because people often feel these dynamics long before they can even articulate them. So Michel Foucault used the concept of governmentality to describe how modern states govern not just through law, but by shaping how populations manage themselves, internalize norms, and become governable subjects, right? Louis Althusser wrote about ideological state apparatuses, institutions like schools and media that reproduce the conditions of a system without constant coercion. Pierre Bourdieu developed the concept of habitus, which describes how social structures get inside us, becoming dispositions and reflexes that shape what feels possible or impossible. James C. Scott explained how modern states rely on legibility, categories, forms, standardization, and data, because legibility makes populations manageable, even as it constrains the lives that have to fit into those categories. And you don't need to know those names to recognize the experience, right? You've lived it. Most of us have. It's the gradual learning of how to behave around authority, not because anyone explained it to you, but because the system trained you. You learn what happens when you ask too many questions. You learn what happens when you miss a deadline. You learn whether rules are consistent enough to respect or arbitrary enough to resent. You learn whether honesty is safe, whether compliance buys stability, whether the system treats you like a participant, a customer, or a problem, or even a suspect. So this is why focusing on something like standing in line, right, misses the real point. The point isn't the line. The point is what the line teaches. The design of the interaction produces something inside you because the state isn't just administering services, it's producing citizens. It's shaping expectations about what you deserve, what you can demand, what you can appeal, and what you can challenge, what you're expected to quietly endure. This is where legitimacy becomes central. Max Weber described modern authority as legal rational, meaning rule-based and procedural. But legitimacy doesn't live in theory, it lives in experience. So if people experience a system as coherent and predictable, even when it's frustrating, procedures can then feel legitimate, right? If a people experience a system as chaotic, punitive, or selectively applied, those same procedures don't teach legitimacy. They teach distrust. That difference isn't cultural in the shallow sense, it's structural. It's the result of how institutions are designed and how they're encountered. This is where many of my European viewers will immediately recognize a contrast. In many European states, even when people complain bitterly about bureaucracy, there's often an underlying assumption that the system exists to function and to provide something public. The frustration happens within a shared premise that there's a collective world and that the collective world has obligations. In the United States here, the training has often been different. So Americans are repeatedly taught, explicitly and implicitly, that public systems are suspect, that collective provision is inefficient, that you're fundamentally on your own, and that freedom means minimizing obligation to others. You can hear that training in how people in the US talk about taxes, healthcare, labor, and public services. That's not just ideology, it's habituation, it's learned reflex. So these patterns matter because they shape how societies respond to crisis. They shape whether people cooperate during emergencies, whether austerity is accepted as inevitable, whether strikes are seen as legitimate political tools or selfish disruptions, and whether social problems are interpreted as moral failures or systemic outcomes. They shape emotional responses long before policy debates even begin. This is also where hegemony matters in the Gramscian sense. Hegemony isn't domination by force alone, it's domination through common sense. It's when the assumption of a system becomes the baseline reality people operate within, even when those assumptions work against them. The state trains hegemony by normalizing certain relationships between worker and employer, citizen and institution, individual and community, private and public. It trains people to accept particular trade-offs as natural and to interpret predictable forms of suffering as personal failure, again, rather than structural design. When we say the state trains citizens, we're really saying the state trains interpretation. It trains what you notice and what you ignore. It trains what you blame yourself for. It trains what you feel entitled to. It trains which humiliations you normalize and which injustices you call just how it is. Legibility plays a huge role here. States want populations they can see, categorize, measure, and manage. That legibility can enable rights, benefits, and protections, but it also forces lives into administrative categories. Like people whose lives don't fit neatly into those categories because of disability, migration status, informal work, poverty, or non-traditional family structures often spend enormous energy performing legibility just to access stability. So that performance is itself a form of training. It teaches you how precarious your position is and what kind of citizen you're allowed to be. And the state also trains through scarcity and withholding, through what it makes you compete for, through what it makes you prove. And proof is a disciplinary mechanism. If you have to constantly prove you deserve help, you're being trained into a moral economy where suffering is suspect and aid is conditional. If you have to constantly prove compliance, you're being trained into fear. If you have to constantly prove productivity, you're being trained into self-surveillance. And self-surveillance is one of the most efficient tools modern systems have because it relocates enforcement inside your own mind. And this is why I keep emphasizing that this isn't just politics, it's social formation. It's the production of the citizen subject. You can see it in the micro details, whether systems are navigable or intentionally confusing, whether processes are transparent or opaque, whether public services are treated as rights or favors, whether accountability mechanisms actually function, whether corruption feels exceptional or expected. And over time, all of that becomes internalized, right? It becomes habitus. It becomes how you move through the world. Different states train different emotional landscapes. Some train trust as a default posture, even if it's skeptical trust. Some train distrust as a survival skill. Some train patience. Some train opportunism. Some train solidarity. Some train isolation. Some train people to see themselves as citizens, members of a shared project. Others train people to see themselves as consumers, purchasing whatever they can afford. And this matters because emotional landscapes shape political possibility. You can't build collective systems out of citizens trained into chronic distrust without addressing the training itself. This is also why systems don't change simply because laws change. You can reform institutions and still have populations that behave as if nothing has changed because they're responding rationally to what they've learned over decades, right? Training lingers. Institutional memory lingers. Embodied knowledge of how things really work lingers, and that lingering is often misdiagnosed as apathy or cynicism when it's actually learned behavior. So that's what this series is going to do. We're gonna map the training, not just in obvious places like education and policing, but in the softer infrastructures of everyday life, bureaucracy, public space, taxation, welfare systems, media ecosystems, and the mundane rituals that teach people who they're allowed to be. We're going to do it comparatively too, because comparison breaks the illusion of inevitability. When you see that behavior varies across systems, you realize it's not human nature, it's design, it's history, it's training. And I want to end this episode with a question that's going to guide everything else in this series. When you picture a good citizen, what do you picture? Someone obedient, someone engaged, someone quiet, someone compliant, someone skeptical, someone who votes and goes home, someone who protests, someone who trusts institutions, someone who avoids them. Because whatever image comes to mind, that image didn't come from nowhere. It was built. You see, it was taught. I want to add one more layer to that. I genuinely want to hear this in the comments, especially from people outside the United States, because the comparisons are the point. What did your state teach you was normal without ever saying it aloud? What kinds of behaviors did your society reward, and what kinds does it quietly punish? And when you move through public life, forums, offices, healthcare, schools, police, public space, what kind of citizen does it feel like you're being trained to become? I look forward to hearing from you all, and I will see you back again soon. If you've enjoyed this content, please feel free to subscribe and follow. Love having you all here. Take care.